In the early hours of May 24th, 1941, two of the Royal Navy's most powerful warships, HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales, steamed through the frigid North Atlantic. Their mission was simple: intercept and destroy a single enemy vessel. But that ship was no ordinary target. It was the Bismarck. Within minutes of engagement, the unthinkable happened. A blinding flash, a massive explosion, and HMS Hood, Britain's most iconic warship, was gone. Over 1,400 men vanished beneath the waves. Only 3 survived. The shock was immediate and devastating, not just for the Royal Navy, but for the entire British Empire. A ship once thought nearly invincible had been obliterated, and the one responsible, Bismarck, was still at large. But what made Bismarck so terrifying? The answer lies in a combination of brute engineering, strategic timing, and ruthless intent. The Bismarck was not just a battleship, it was a weapon of psychological warfare, a floating fortress that threatened to upend Britain's fragile grip on the Atlantic. Built in secret and launched in 1939, Bismarck was a symbol of Nazi Germany's naval ambition. It was massive, over 250 meters long, heavily armored, and capable of firing shells weighing nearly a ton each. It could outrun most ships, outgun almost all of them, and survive damage that would sink any other vessel. But Bismarck was not designed for glory in fleet battles. She had a more sinister purpose: to hunt down and destroy Allied merchant convoys that were keeping Britain alive. If Bismarck could reach open waters, she could cripple supply lines and starve the island nation into submission. The British knew this. They knew the stakes. And so, when Bismarck was spotted sailing with the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen into the Atlantic, the order was clear: find her and sink her at any cost. What followed was one of the most intense and dramatic naval hunts in history. Over 50 ships, including aircraft carriers, cruisers, and destroyers, were thrown into the chase. The Royal Navy would stop at nothing. Not because Bismarck had sunk a ship, but because she had sunk the ship. Hood's loss was not just a tactical disaster, it was a humiliation, a blow to national pride. This is the story of how a single warship sent shockwaves through the mightiest navy in the world. A story of technology, bravery, and tragedy on the high seas. And above all, it is the story of how the Bismarck, in a matter of days, went from a feared predator to a hunted legend. They said she was unsinkable. When the Bismarck slipped into the waters from the Blom and Voss shipyard in Hamburg in 1939, she was not just another battleship. She was a declaration, a towering, steel-clad message to the world that Germany had returned to the high seas, no longer shackled by the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler himself stood at the launch, proud, certain, calling on future officers to prove themselves worthy of this great vessel. But what was it about the Bismarck that demanded such reverence? What made her the centerpiece of Nazi naval might, and the embodiment of fear for every Allied sailor? Let us take a closer look. The Bismarck was colossal, stretching over 250 meters long and displacing more than 50,000 tons when fully loaded. She dwarfed most ships of her time. Her sheer presence was intimidating. But size was only the beginning. She was fitted with 8 15-inch guns, mounted in 4 twin turrets, 2 forward, 2 aft. Each of those guns could hurl a shell the size of a small car, more than 20 miles. With pinpoint accuracy, it was not just firepower, it was devastation. And then there was the armor. Bismarck did not just wear her armor like a shield, she wore it like a fortress. Her main belt, running along the sides of her hull, was over a foot thick. Her decks, her turrets, her conning tower, each reinforced with layers of steel designed to withstand the fiercest blows. Internal bulkheads divided the ship into watertight compartments, making her exceptionally difficult to flood. She was not just built to fight, she was built to survive. But perhaps her most underrated feature was her speed. At full power, Bismarck could reach 29 knots over 33 miles per hour. That is fast for a ship her size. But what truly set her apart was the ability to maintain that speed even in stormy Atlantic waters. Many ships advertise top speeds, but those figures drop dramatically in rough seas. Not Bismarck. She was engineered with a wide beam and powerful propulsion systems that allowed her to plow through waves without slowing down. She was, quite literally, a moving fortress, able to chase or flee at will, regardless of the weather. Now imagine you are a British convoy captain in 1941. You have got a line of merchant vessels under your protection, zigzagging through the gray Atlantic to avoid German U-boats. Your escort consists of destroyers and corvettes, quick and agile but lightly armed. You hear over the radio Bismarck has broken into the Atlantic. What do? You scatter because you know that if Bismarck catches you, there is no fighting back. No destroyer, no escort ship stands a chance. Her guns could tear through steel like paper. Your only hope is to run, to vanish into the mist, and hope she chooses another target. That is the fear the Bismarck inspired not just among admirals in London, but in every sailor crossing the Atlantic. But her design was not merely about brute strength or speed. It was calculated part of a greater German naval strategy known as sea denial. While the British Royal Navy aimed to control the seas, projecting power globally like it had done for centuries, the German Kriegsmarine took a different approach. They did not need to dominate the oceans. They just needed to make them deadly. Submarines, U-boats, were the primary weapon in that campaign. But capital ships like the Bismarck played a critical role too. A battleship of her magnitude could force the British to commit vast resources just to counter a single threat. And if she got loose in the Atlantic, she could devastate convoys, sinking ton after ton of desperately needed supplies, oil, and food. In essence, Bismarck did not need to fight the Royal Navy head-on. She just had to be there to be a threat, and the British knew it. That is why, when the Bismarck finally left port in May 1941, the Royal Navy was waiting. They had tracked her from the moment she passed the Danish Straits. They knew she was sailing with the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen on a mission called Operation Rheinübung. But they did not know her exact route or intentions. All they knew was that she had to be stopped. Bismarck's breakout into the Atlantic was not her first act, but it was her boldest. And every inch of her guns, her armor, her speed was built for this. She was not just a ship. She was a legend in motion. But legends, even the fiercest ones, are not invincible. And as we follow Bismarck's journey, from the cold waters off Norway to the thunderous confrontation in the Denmark Strait, we will discover how this masterpiece of naval engineering, this symbol of Nazi pride, became both the hunter and the hunted. Because what sinks a ship like the Bismarck is not always a bigger gun or a better crew. Sometimes it is persistence, it is desperation, and sometimes it is fate. Most people think battleships are built to clash in titanic showdowns, broadside to broadside, steel against steel. But Bismarck was different. She was not created to lead a fleet into battle. She was crafted with a darker, more strategic purpose, to vanish into the Atlantic and prey on Britain's lifeline, the convoys. Britain in 1941 was not a self-sustaining empire. It was an island, dependent on the constant flow of supplies from across the oceans. Food, oil, ammunition, raw materials, everything needed to survive and fight came by ship. And those merchant ships, scattered across vast waters, were painfully vulnerable. That is where Bismarck came in. She was not meant to meet enemy fleets head-on. That would have been a waste of her design. No, Her job was to sneak into the shipping lanes and sow chaos, to strike fear into every convoy, to force ships to scatter at the mere whisper of her name, and to let the waiting wolf packs, Germany's dreaded U-boats, do the rest. And the British knew it. They would face this strategy before. German cruisers and pocket battleships had raided merchant routes early in the war, but none had the scale or destructive potential of Bismarck. She was something else entirely. She could outrun most of the ships that could outgun her, and she could outgun anything that could catch her. In a well-coordinated strike, Bismarck could cripple a convoy, destroy the escorts, and leave the merchant vessels defenseless. The Royal Navy would be forced to respond by stretching itself thinner, diverting battleships and cruisers just to cover convoys' ships they could barely spare. It was naval strategy by psychological warfare. Imagine this. You are a convoy commander in the North Atlantic. Your radar crackles. A transmission comes through. Bismarck has been spotted. Somewhere. Not close, but close enough. What do? Your destroyers tighten their perimeter. Your helmsmen adjust course. The merchant ships are told to be ready to scatter. Why? Because if Bismarck appears on the horizon, your carefully arranged formation becomes a death trap. You can't fight her. You can't outrun her. All you can do is break apart and run in every direction, praying she chooses someone else to chase. And that is the genius of her role, not just to sink ships, but to fracture the rhythm of Allied logistics. To turn the Atlantic into a graveyard of steel and shattered hopes, her presence alone disrupted the flow of war. When Bismarck left port in May 1941 for Operation Rheinübung, she was not just on a raid. She was enacting a strategy that had been carefully calculated by Germany's naval command. Her companion, the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, added punch to the operation, but make no mistake, Bismarck was the tip of the spear. But even as she moved through the cold waters, her path was shadowed. The British, watching nervously, understood what this mission meant. If Bismarck got free into the Atlantic, unchecked and resupplied, she could become a ghost ship, striking where and when she chose. The Royal Navy, still the largest fleet on Earth, would be forced to chase her across thousands of miles, reacting instead of commanding. That is the terror she inspired. It was not just the fear of her guns, it was the chaos she created. Her threat was asymmetrical, one ship threatening an empire's supply chain. She was not just a battleship. She was a strategic weapon. And yet, for all her menace, she was also vulnerable, not because of a design flaw or a weak crew, but because she was too dangerous to be left alone. The British could not ignore her. Churchill himself knew that her escape into the open ocean would spell catastrophe. That is why, when Bismarck was sighted heading west, the Royal Navy launched its largest hunt in history. Over 50 ships, including battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, and destroyers, were dispatched. Fuel be damned. Orders were simple. Find her, stop her, sink her. This was not just a military response. It was an act of national survival. Bismarck's legend was not forged in the number of ships she sank, but in the number of ships that chased her. The fear she cast over the sea lanes forced Britain to throw everything into the hunt. And that is exactly what made her so effective. Even in silence, she disrupted. Even unseen, she terrified. But no ship, no matter how powerful, can remain a phantom forever. And as the clouds gathered over the cold Atlantic, a confrontation was brewing. A clash that would decide not just the fate of one vessel, but the course of naval warfare itself. Because once Bismarck entered the ocean, there were only two outcomes left. She would return to port as a hero of the Reich, or she would never return at all. Long before the Bismarck ever fired a shot, she was already a weapon of propaganda, of pride, and of political defiance. Her keel had barely been laid when Hitler's intentions became clear. This was not just a battleship. It was a message. To understand her true meaning, you have to go back to the humiliation Germany suffered after World War I. The Treaty of Versailles did not just punish Germany, it crippled her ability to project power. Her navy, once the pride of the Kaiser's empire, was reduced to a shell. No submarines, no battleships, no future on the seas. And then, in 1939, towering above the Blom and Voss shipyard, came the Bismarck. Gleaming, immense, unstoppable, she was a direct challenge to the restrictions that had once shackled Germany. The world watched as Adolf Hitler, now Führer of a resurgent Reich, christened the ship with solemn ceremony. Standing beside the officers who would one day command her, he made a chilling promise that the Bismarck would be a name remembered in glory. He was right, but not in the way he imagined. Bismarck was not just a battleship. She was a carefully crafted myth. Her very existence flew in the face of international agreements. She embodied the rejection of post-war submission and signaled a new, dangerous chapter. To Hitler, she was more than steel and firepower. She was the floating embodiment of German resurrection. The world had said no more after 1918. And Bismarck was Germany's answer, yes. Again, that symbolism was not accidental. Everything about her was engineered for effect, and not just militarily. Her design was sleek and imposing, her gun crews drilled relentlessly, her image carefully broadcast in newsreels and speeches. German propaganda painted her as the ultimate weapon of the seas, an unstoppable force that would sweep aside British arrogance and restore naval supremacy to the Reich. She was not built in secret, she was built to be seen. The timing of her launch was also no coincidence. Europe was already on its knees. Within a year of the war's outbreak, Nazi forces had swept through Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies over the continent. On land, the Wehrmacht seemed unbeatable. And now, with the Bismarck, Hitler was extending that dominance to the sea. For a Britain that had long ruled the oceans, it was a deeply personal threat. The Royal Navy was not just a military institution, it was a symbol of empire. For over a century, Britain's sea power had been the foundation of its global dominance. It had beaten Napoleon, blockaded Germany in the Great War, and safeguarded trade routes that stretched from Singapore to Sierra Leone. To challenge that supremacy was to challenge Britain itself. And Hitler knew it. Deploying Bismarck was not merely strategic, it was theatrical, a performance designed to unnerve Britain and embolden the Reich. Her presence in the Atlantic was not just a threat to convoys, it was a public display of strength, a reminder that Germany would not be contained. But Bismarck's mission was not just about sending a message. She was part of a calculated shift in Germany's naval warfare doctrine. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the head of the Kriegsmarine, had watched jealously as the Army and Air Force scored one dazzling victory after another. The Navy, meanwhile, had remained largely in the background, its U-boats effective but hidden, its surface fleet underutilized. Raeder needed a victory of his own, something spectacular. He needed a symbol. And so, Operation Regenbogen was born. The goal: break Bismarck and her escort, the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, into the North Atlantic. Avoid direct conflict. Hit British convoys hard. Make them bleed. Force the Royal Navy to respond. Make them look weak. It was a high-stakes gamble, but it carried the full weight of Hitler's political ambitions and Raeder's desire for naval glory. But there is a dangerous truth about symbols. The higher they rise, the farther they fall. Bismarck was expected to sail unchallenged, to terrorize and return in triumph, but in war, expectations rarely survive contact with reality. And so the legend began to unravel. The British knew they could not allow Bismarck to succeed, not just for tactical reasons, but for morale. The loss of France had shocked the empire. The Blitz had devastated cities. Britain stood alone. If the Bismarck roamed free, it would be more than a military failure. It would be a psychological blow, a confirmation of decline. That is why, when word came that Bismarck had left port, the Royal Navy reacted with overwhelming force. This was not just another interception, it was a hunt for redemption. And the moment HMS Hood was lost in a flash of fire and steel, Britain's most beloved warship gone, in seconds, the propaganda battle turned into something far more primal. Bismarck had become a monster. And monsters, no matter how mighty, must be slain. But in that moment, between pride and panic, between German ambition and British desperation, the Bismarck fulfilled her symbolic purpose. She terrified, she enraged, she drew the world's attention to the cold waters of the North Atlantic. She had already made history. Now she was about to become legend. May 1941. The North Atlantic lay cold and restless beneath gray skies, its waves concealing both merchant convoys and the steel beasts that hunted them. Somewhere out there, slipping through fog and shadow, the Bismarck had set sail, finally free. She was not alone. Alongside her steamed the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, swift and armed, shadowing her larger sister like a deadly escort. Together they formed the spearhead of Operation Rheinübung, Germany's bold plan to punch a hole in Britain's Atlantic lifeline. Their orders were simple: evade detection, strike fast, and cripple Britain's supply routes. No more testing, no more trials. This was it, their first real engagement, and potentially a turning point in the war at sea. The Allies had been watching. Ever since the Bismarck left the Baltic port of Gdynia, British codebreakers, aircraft, and warships had scrambled to track her. They knew what was at stake. If Bismarck disappeared into the Atlantic, she could bring the entire transatlantic convoy system to its knees. Dozens, maybe hundreds of ships would be at risk. Oil, food, tanks, ammunition, all of it could sink beneath the waves. So the Royal Navy acted. And at the tip of the British counterstrike stood HMS Hood, the most famous and beloved warship in the British fleet. She was not just a battlecruiser, she was a national symbol. Long, sleek, and powerful, the Hood had toured the world in peacetime, projecting British might wherever she sailed. Sailors called her the Mighty Hood. The public adored her. Even the enemy respected her. But beneath the glamour, the Hood carried a dangerous flaw. She had been built for a different era. Her armor, especially on the decks, was not designed to withstand modern plunging shells fired from extreme ranges. Her speed was her defense, and in an age of heavy guns and radar-guided engagement, that might not be enough. And yet, when the call came, she answered. Alongside her was the HMS Prince of Wales, a brand-new battleship still shaking off her teething problems. Her crew was green, her systems untested, but she carried powerful 14-inch guns and a fighting spirit to match any ship afloat. The two warships steamed toward the Denmark Strait, the narrow, treacherous corridor between Iceland and Greenland, hoping to cut off Bismarck before she vanished into open sea. On the morning of May 24th, 1941, they found her. The fog lifted. Spotters called out. Two silhouettes appeared on the horizon, first the Prinz Eugen, then the unmistakable bulk of the Bismarck. Engines roared to full power. Guns swiveled into place. The stage was set. The British made the first move. At 5:52 a.m., the Hood opened fire. Her massive 15-inch guns thundered across the waves, hurling shells toward the enemy. Prince of Wales followed seconds later. The Germans returned fire, calmly and with deadly precision. It was over almost before it began. Just minutes into the exchange, barely enough time for either side to adjust, range the Bismarck's gunners struck gold. A shell, likely from one of her forward turrets, plunged through Hood's weak deck armor, straight into her aft magazine. What happened next was not a battle, but an eruption, a flash of light. A roar, louder than thunder, a towering column of flame and smoke. In an instant, the Hood was gone, split in two, torn apart by her own exploding ammunition. Of her crew of over 1,400 men, only 3 survived. The Royal Navy, indeed, all of Britain, was stunned. The pride of the fleet had been obliterated, and not just by any enemy, but by the very ship they had feared most. The Bismarck had not just won a skirmish, she had delivered a devastating psychological blow. She had proven, with terrifying speed, that the mighty Royal Navy was not invincible, and for the men aboard the Prince of Wales, still locked in combat, reality came crashing down. Suddenly alone against 2 German ships, the Prince of Wales continued to fight. Her gunners scored a few hits, damaging Bismarck's bow and severing fuel lines, but the cost was high. Shells rained down. One punched through the bridge. Damage mounted. Systems failed. Eventually, the Prince of Wales had to retreat under cover of smoke, her decks burning, her mission unfinished. But the damage had already been done on both sides. Bismarck had destroyed the Hood, yes, but in doing so, she had sealed her own fate. British vengeance was now absolute. The entire Royal Navy would mobilize. Nothing short of total destruction would be accepted. Bismarck, once the hunter, was now the hunted. But in that moment, amid shattered steel and sinking pride, the world saw the Bismarck at her most powerful. Her guns had silenced Britain's most revered warship. Her armor had deflected blows that should have sunk lesser vessels. She had fulfilled her design, her myth, and her mission, all in the span of minutes. But the ocean was far from done with her, and neither was Britain. In the moments following the destruction of HMS Hood, a silence settled across the Royal Navy. It was not the kind of silence that comes from confusion. It was the sound of disbelief, of grief, of something sacred being shattered. The Hood had not just been a warship. She had been the pride of Britain, a floating emblem of maritime supremacy, and in less than 10 minutes, she had vanished beneath the waves. But Bismarck was still afloat, still sailing, and that single fact sent shockwaves through the entire Allied command. Until that moment, even with all the warnings, all the intelligence reports, there had been a certain confidence, a belief, deep-rooted and perhaps arrogant, that no single German ship could truly challenge the full might of the Royal Navy. The Hood was supposed to prove that. Instead, her smoldering wreck proved the opposite. The impossible had happened. And Bismarck had done it. For the first time in the war, Britain's control of the seas had been openly, brutally challenged. The psychological impact of Hood's loss ran deep. In Parliament, in Churchill's war rooms, in every naval base across the empire, one word was whispered, with a mixture of fear and fury: Bismarck. And then came the decision. Not debated, not questioned. It came like a reflex from the top down. She had to be destroyed, no matter the cost. Within hours, Operation Sink the Bismarck was underway. It would become the largest naval hunt in history. Over 50 Royal Navy ships were ordered to the Atlantic. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers, they abandoned convoy duties, cut short missions, refueled at sea if necessary. No ship was spared. Every vessel available was redirected toward one purpose: find her, track her, end her. And yet, Bismarck was not easy prey. Even after the brutal battle in the Denmark Strait, she was still afloat. Her engines running, her guns operational. She had taken hits from Prince of Wales. Yes, but nothing fatal. She limped on, her fuel tanks damaged, but her fighting spirit intact. Captain Ernst Lindemann and Admiral Gunther Lütjens knew the eyes of the Reich were watching. The mission had changed, but failure was not an option. For a time, Bismarck vanished into the vastness of the Atlantic. Radio silence. No smoke on the horizon. No radar echo. Just the sea. It was a haunting reminder of how vulnerable even the most powerful navies could be in modern warfare. No matter how vast the fleet, how advanced the technology, one rogue battleship could slip through the cracks, and in doing so, threaten everything. Convoys scattered. Admirals stayed awake through the night. Every merchant captain feared a shadow on the waves. Bismarck was now not just a battleship, she was a phantom. But every phantom leaves a trace. And in this case, it was a fateful mistake. Bismarck transmitted a message to Berlin, reporting damage and requesting assistance. The British intercepted it. With renewed focus, they narrowed the search area. Soon, a Catalina flying boat spotted an oil slick trailing across the surface of the Atlantic. It was her. The net began to tighten. The aircraft carrier HMS Royal launched swordfish torpedo bombers biplanes, outdated and slow, relics of a different era, and yet they carried the fate of Bismarck in their torpedo racks. Despite brutal weather and fierce anti-aircraft fire, one of those torpedoes struck gold. It jammed Bismarck's rudder. That hit changed everything. Bismarck, once fast and agile, now turned helplessly in slow, wide circles. Her engines still roared, but she could not steer. In essence, she was doomed, drifting toward the pursuing British fleet, like a wounded beast. And this is where the story turns from pursuit to reckoning. In the early hours of May 27, 1941, the Royal Navy surrounded the crippled battleship. HMS King George V and HMS Rodney opened fire first. Their shells hammered Bismarck relentlessly. One after another, explosions tore into her armor. Bismarck returned fire, but her aim was wild, her systems collapsing. The legendary warship, once the most feared ship in the world, was being dismantled. By the time the order to scuttle came from within, it was already too late. The Bismarck was dying. Her crew tried to open valves, set charges anything to avoid letting her fall into enemy hands. But as the waves rose and steel groaned, she began to sink, her stern rising high as the Atlantic finally claimed her. Of the more than 2,200 men aboard, only around 115 would survive. And so, in that cold stretch of ocean, a chapter closed. But what remains is the lesson. Bismarck had shown that no ship, no matter how powerful, was invincible. Hood had gone down in minutes. Bismarck had defied the odds, wounded her enemies, and very nearly escaped justice. But modern war had evolved. Speed, firepower, and armor were no longer enough. Radar, code breaking, air power, and relentless coordination had changed the game. The age of the battleship, the Titans of Steel, was ending. The future would belong to those who could adapt, not just dominate. Still, the legend of the Bismarck endures, because for one brief, blazing moment, she ruled the waves. By the time the Atlantic had swallowed the Bismarck, the story was no longer just about a ship. It had become legend, a tale etched into the steel nerves of every navy, a symbol of fear, vengeance, and the closing of an era. For Britain, her sinking was not merely a tactical victory, it was a national catharsis, a necessary, almost ritualistic act of justice after the stunning loss of HMS Hood. But beneath the emotional storm that followed her destruction, something deeper had shifted, something strategic, something permanent. The age of the great battleship, once the undisputed king of naval warfare, was quietly fading beneath the waves. For decades, battleships had been the pride of fleets and the centerpiece of maritime strategy. They were floating fortresses, armor-plated titans, bristling with enormous guns, built to dominate and intimidate. In both world wars, they had symbolized national power, political will, and technological might. Their sheer presence could alter the balance of a campaign or intimidate an enemy into inaction. But Bismarck's short, fiery saga exposed a painful truth. These ships, massive, majestic, and staggeringly expensive, were no longer the apex predators of the sea. Their time had passed, even if no one had yet said it out loud. Because what truly doomed Bismarck was not a better battleship. It was not an epic duel between titans. It was a fragile-looking biplane, an outdated canvas-winged swordfish torpedo bomber launched from a carrier deck, battling wind and waves to drop its payload. The hit that jammed Bismarck's rudder did not just cripple her movement, it cracked the myth of battleship invincibility. For admirals and strategists watching from both sides of the war, that moment changed everything. Air power had proven itself not just in the skies over Britain or in the bombing raids on Europe, but here, out at sea, where ships had once ruled unchallenged. And it was not just about aircraft, carriers. Submarines had already been ravaging merchant shipping for years. Fast, stealthy, and hard to detect, U-boats could cripple supply lines with a single torpedo. The surface fleet was no longer the only, or even the most important, player. The sinking of the Bismarck was both a conclusion and a warning, a grand, tragic finale to the battleship era. Germany never again deployed such a vessel with the same confidence. Her sister ship, the Tirpitz, remained largely inactive, haunted by Bismarck's fate, trapped in Norway, and eventually destroyed from the air. Across the Atlantic, the United States Navy was already shifting its focus. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese would soon hammer the final nail into the battleship's coffin. And in the Pacific, carriers would soon dictate the outcome of every major naval engagement. But what made Bismarck's tale so haunting was not just how she died, it was how she lived. For a brief moment, she was unstoppable. She shattered the hood. She outmaneuvered fleets. She evaded detection. She nearly vanished into the vastness of the ocean. Untouchable. Her design was brilliant. Her armor, guns, and speed represented the pinnacle of German engineering. She was the last great warship to capture the world's imagination in that way. And that is why her story still echoes, not just as a lesson in evolving warfare, but as a human story of courage, of pride, of ambition and tragedy. The men who built her, the sailors who served on her, the enemies who feared her all, were part of something far larger than steel and strategy. They were part of a moment where history pivoted. In the days after the Bismarck went down, her survivors floated in freezing water, clinging to life, watching their steel world slip into the abyss. Some were pulled to safety by British destroyers. Others disappeared into the dark sea. On both sides, sailors wept for the dead. Even in war, respect lingers where bravery is undeniable, and that, too, became part of the legend. Today, Bismarck rests 4,791 meters beneath the surface. Her hull lies silent, broken but proud. She is a monument to a vanished age. Divers who visit her wreck speak of awe, not just at her size, but at what she represents, a moment when the world changed course, because that is what Bismarck truly became, a symbol, not only of Nazi ambition or British resolve, but of a shift in how wars would be fought, not with broadsides and salvos alone, but with radar, code-breaking, aircraft, and submarines. It was not just the Bismarck that was sunk, it was the very idea that ships like her could decide the future. So if you stand today on the deck of an aircraft carrier, or track sonar in a submarine command center, know that part of your world was forged in those cold May waters of 1941, in the flash of Hood's destruction, in the stubborn chase across the Atlantic, in the final, flaming stand of Bismarck. She fought like a lion. She died like a legend. And in doing so, she closed one chapter of history and opened the next. Long after the guns fell silent and the war ended, the ghost of the Bismarck refused to fade. Her story, forged in steel and fire, lingered like smoke over the oceans she once threatened to command. In Germany, she became a relic of shattered ambition. In Britain, a cautionary tale wrapped in triumph. But across the world, her legacy stirred something more complex. A fascination with the line between heroism and hubris, between brilliance and blind faith in outdated power. The physical wreck of the Bismarck was lost for decades. She had disappeared into the Atlantic's icy depths in 1941, taking over 2,000 souls with her. For years, she remained undisturbed, her exact location unknown until 1989, when famed oceanographer Robert Ballard, who had previously discovered the Titanic, finally located the Bismarck's resting place. What he found was not a disintegrated hulk, but a remarkably intact warship, silent, majestic, and dignified even in defeat. Her hull was riddled with shell holes, her massive turrets torn away, but her structure was largely whole. Bismarck had not exploded apart or sunk solely from British firepower. She had been scuttled by her own crew, an act of defiance to the last. They had chosen to take her down themselves rather than let her fall into enemy hands. Even in defeat, there was a strange kind of victory. This discovery reignited global interest in her story. Documentaries were produced, books were written, and historians debated long into the night. Could Bismarck have escaped if not for that fateful torpedo to her rudder? Could the Hood have survived had she been better armored? Had the entire chase, so dramatic in public, altered naval policy forever? But beneath the technical questions lay a deeper truth. Bismarck had become myth. Like the Titanic, like the Lusitania, like the Hood herself, she transcended mere history. Her name alone could summon emotion, even from those born generations later. And in this myth, we saw reflected our human obsession with greatness and its downfall. In Germany, the Bismarck was both a source of pride and painful memory. She had represented technological brilliance, industrial achievement, and military prowess. But she had also been a tool of the Nazi regime, part of Hitler's propaganda machine, christened in defiance of Versailles, deployed to serve a tyrant's ambition. Post-war Germany could not celebrate her without also remembering the horrors of the regime that built her. And so, the memory of Bismarck became quiet, acknowledged, studied, but not exalted. Naval officers admired her design. Engineers analyzed her survivability, but she did not receive parades or public monuments. She was remembered more for the tragedy of her men than for the regime that sent them to sea. In Britain, the story was different. Bismarck's saga became an almost mythological redemption arc. The loss of the Hood, so sudden and shocking, had wounded national pride, but the pursuit and sinking of Bismarck offered catharsis. It was proof that Britain could strike back, that the sea, long considered Britain's domain, would not be surrendered without a reckoning. Even Churchill himself famously issued the order, "Sink the Bismarck." And when the Royal Navy did, it marked more than just the sinking of a ship. It was the death of fear, of the notion that German power at sea could go unchecked. For British citizens, it felt like justice. For the sailors who participated, it was deeply personal. Many had known men on the Hood. Many had seen what Bismarck could do. When they saw her burn, they saw vengeance fulfilled. Yet even among the victors, there was respect. Reports from survivors of the engagement recalled silence as the Bismarck slipped beneath the waves. No cheering, no celebration. Only the grim realization that thousands had died, men not so different from themselves. And from that silence grew a kind of reverence. That reverence endures. Today, naval academies still teach the lessons of the Bismarck campaign. Tactics are analyzed, communication failures dissected, radar air power, convoy protection, all these concepts are traced through the story of her rise and fall. She has become not only a symbol, but a case study, a symbol of the end of one era and the violent birth of another. But perhaps the most enduring part of Bismarck's story lies not in what she did, or even how she died, but in what she represented, the last gasp of battleship supremacy, the seductive illusion of invincibility, the tragedy of men caught between pride and reality. In the end, the Bismarck was not defeated by better guns or bigger ships. She was undone by the world changing around her, by a new age of warfare in which invisibility, coordination, and the sky itself dictated outcomes more than armor or range. Her wreck lies at the bottom of the ocean, but her legacy floats far above. In every drone-launched missile, in every submarine patrol, in every satellite that scans the sea, the shadow of the Bismarck lingers. Because once, not so long ago, we believed that steel alone could rule the waves. And then the Bismarck taught us otherwise. The Bismarck now lies entombed beneath nearly 5 kilometers of cold Atlantic water, silent, broken, but never forgotten. Her twisted metal and rusting turrets serve not only as a grave, but as a monument to a turning point in naval history. Because Bismarck was never just a warship. She was a warning, a final, thunderous statement from an era that was already fading. When she was launched in 1939, the world stood at the edge of a technological revolution. Nations still built battleships, with the belief that size and firepower alone could dictate victory. Bismarck was the embodiment of that belief, a masterpiece of naval engineering, a fortress of steel that could weather storms and hurl destruction across miles of sea. She was designed to terrify. And for a moment, she did. She shattered the pride of the Royal Navy in a single, devastating blow. She danced away from her pursuers, vanished into fog, and dared the greatest fleet in the world to catch her. The British responded with fury and desperation, throwing the full weight of their naval power into a manhunt unlike any other. And even then, it was not overwhelming force that doomed Bismarck. It was a single torpedo from a slow, outdated biplane that sealed her fate. In that moment, the battleship age died, not with a political treaty or a strategic decision, but with a jolt of impact against a rudder and a shift in global thinking. After Bismarck, no navy would ever again place its future entirely in the hands of steel giants. Carriers, aircraft, and submarines would become the new arbiters of power at sea. Speed and mobility, stealth and coordination, these would define the future of naval warfare. But Bismarck's legacy is not only found in strategy, it is in the stories of the men who lived and died aboard her, in the freezing waters where survivors clung to debris, waiting to be rescued by their enemies, in the faces of the British sailors who watched their own Pride the Hood explode into fire and disappear in seconds, in the quiet, haunted expressions of the swordfish pilots who knew their torpedoes might send over 2,000 men to the bottom of the ocean. There was heroism on both sides, and tragedy, and stubborn, relentless human will. To this day, people still visit the Bismarck's grave. Sonar scans show her shape, lying still, barely disturbed after all these decades. Some who've been there say she looks peaceful. Others say she still radiates defiance, and maybe both are true. Because in her rise and fall, we see a story much larger than war. We see the arrogance of unchecked ambition, the limits of brute force, the collision between old empires and new technologies. We see how quickly legends can be shattered, and how even in defeat they can endure. For Germany, Bismarck was both an achievement and an omen. Her power proved German engineering could rival the world, but her fate proved that glory, without foresight, leads to ruin. For Britain, her sinking brought relief, but also sobering reflection. The Royal Navy could still fight and win, but not as it had before. Change had come. The sea itself demanded it. And for the rest of us, the Bismarck offers something more enduring than tactics or timelines. She offers perspective. In every towering symbol of power, there is vulnerability. In every well-laid plan, the possibility of failure. And in every loss, the chance to learn something that might prevent the next one. The sea remembers. It holds our triumphs and mistakes, our inventions and our dead. The Bismarck, resting on its floor, speaks not with guns, but with silence, a silence full of questions. What do we build to protect ourselves? And what happens when the very things we build become our downfall? Maybe that is why this story still captivates, because the Bismarck is not just history, she is a mirror. And in her, we see the tides of human ambition, rising and falling, over and over again.